I did not steal anything. I was just fulfilling my promise to those who did not return.
Here, promises are worthless if you do not have papers.
They handcuffed the old man at the gas station. Then a Marine colonel arrived and saluted. "Please," Frank whispered, his weathered hands trembling as the cold metal clicked around his wrists. "I serve this country. I just need—" Officer Rodriguez paused, recognizing something familiar in the old man's bearing despite his obvious desperation. "Everyone has a story," the young security guard Kevin interrupted dismissively. "Law's the law." But Rodriguez, an Iraq war veteran himself, felt his chest tighten as he looked into Frank's hollow eyes. Eyes that had seen combat sacrifice and now the crushing weight of forgotten heroism. The handcuffs felt heavier than any equipment Frank had carried in Vietnam, each click of the metal marking another nail in the coffin of his dignity, until a black Jeep pulled into the station and everything changed. Don't miss what happens next in this incredible true story of a forgotten hero's redemption. Like this video if it moved you? Subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and compassion, and listen to the full story to discover how one Marine salute changed everything. Your support helps us share these powerful tales that remind us never to forget our heroes. A gray-haired old man was handcuffed at a gas station for theft. But when a Marine colonel appeared and saluted, the heartbreaking truth about a forgotten hero was finally revealed. Sometimes heroes fall, but it only takes one person to remind the world of their true worth. The Shell gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix blazed under the merciless June sun. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt as the temperature soared past 110 degrees. The constant hum of air conditioners mixed with the rumble of 18-wheelers and the sharp scent of gasoline. Customers hurried between their vehicles and the convenience store, seeking refuge from the desert heat that could kill the unprepared. Frank Morrison, 78, stood trembling before the sandwich display, his weathered hands shaking from more than just age. His faded Marine Corps cap sat crooked on his silver head, covering eyes that had seen too much. The worn denim jacket hung loose on his shrinking frame, and his sneakers had holes that let in the scorching pavement. 50 years ago, Sergeant Frank Morrison was a different man. At Khe Sanh in 1968, he had crawled through enemy fire to drag 12 wounded Marines to safety, earning the Medal of Valor and Purple Heart. The young warrior who once carried men twice his size now struggled to carry groceries. After the war, he'd worked 40 years as a mechanic, raised 2 daughters, and buried his beloved wife Martha 3 years ago. Cancer had taken her, and the medical bills had taken everything else. His daughters lived across the country, now busy with their own lives, unaware their father survived on $847 monthly Social Security and food stamps that never lasted the month. Frank's stomach cramped with familiar pain. He hadn't eaten in 36 hours, surviving on tap water and pride. In his pocket, $3.47, enough for bread, but the grilled chicken sandwich cost $6.99. His medication made him dizzy when he didn't eat, and today the world spun dangerously. He gripped the refrigerator handle, staring at the sandwich that represented a choice between dignity and survival. The bread would keep him alive another day, but the sandwich might give him strength to make it through the week. Frank's reflection in the refrigerator glass showed a stranger, hollow cheeks, desperate eyes, the ghost of the man who once stood proud in dress blues. "Just this once," he whispered, remembering how Marines never left anyone behind. Maybe society wouldn't leave him behind either. The sandwich felt warm through the packaging, real food after days of stale bread and peanut butter. He thought of Martha, how she'd pack his lunch with love notes tucked inside. "You'd understand, wouldn't you, sweetheart?" he murmured, sliding the sandwich inside his jacket. The weight against his chest felt like shame and salvation combined. His hand shook as he calculated bread for $2.99, leaving 48 cents. The sandwich would be his secret, his survival, his fall from grace. But hunger was an enemy more relentless than any he'd faced in Vietnam, and this battle he was losing. Frank studied the store's rhythm like a military operation. Sarah, the young cashier, handled the steady stream of truckers and travelers with practiced efficiency. Security cameras dotted the ceiling, but their angles seemed focused on the register and entrance. The refrigerated section sat in a relative blind spot. Kevin, the new security guard, paced near the front, more interested in his phone than customers. At 25, he wore his authority like an ill-fitting uniform, eager to prove himself worthy of the badge and radio clipped to his belt. Frank's plan was simple: purchase the bread, legitimately walk out, normally survive another day. No one would suspect a frail veteran of anything more dangerous than forgetting his wallet. He'd served his country with honor. Surely that earned him one small mercy from fate. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd once planned tactical operations now plotting to steal a sandwich. But desperation had its own strategic requirements, and Frank Morrison was nothing if not adaptable. Frank approached the counter, bread clutched in arthritic fingers. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat echoing in his ears like incoming mortars. Sarah's smile was genuine, reminding him of his youngest daughter at that age. "Just the bread today, sir." "Yes, miss?" His voice cracked like old leather. He fumbled for the crumpled bill's hands, betraying his nervousness. Sarah counted out his change with patient kindness, unaware of the contraband pressed against his chest. "Have a good day, sir. Stay cool out there." Frank nodded, turning toward the exit. Freedom was 10 steps away, 5 steps, 3 steps. Then disaster struck with the soft thud of the sandwich hitting the linoleum floor. The sound seemed to echo through the store like a gunshot. Time froze. Sarah's eyes widened. Other customers turned to stare. The sandwich lay between them like evidence of a crime, its packaging bright and accusatory under the fluorescent lights. Frank's carefully constructed plan crumbled like his dignity, leaving him exposed and ashamed before strangers who would never understand the desperation that drove a hero to theft. "Sir, did you take that without paying?" Sarah's voice carried more confusion than accusation. She was young enough to be his granddaughter, and the disappointment in her eyes cut deeper than any enemy blade. Frank's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. How could he explain that hunger was a torture more persistent than any he'd endured as a POW, that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford, that the man who once carried wounded Marines through rice paddies now couldn't carry the weight of his own shame? I'm sorry." He whispered the words, scraping his throat raw. "I'll pay for it. But there was no just. No excuse that could bridge the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become. A trucker in a Peterbilt cap stepped closer, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "What's going on here? This old man stealing." The word stealing hit Frank like a physical blow. In 78 years, he'd never taken what wasn't his. Now reduced to this moment, he understood how quickly honor could crumble under the weight of necessity. Kevin materialized like a storm cloud hand resting on his radio with practiced authority. At 25, he'd been security guard for exactly 1 week, and this was his first real incident. His supervisor had been clear zero tolerance for theft, regardless of circumstances. "What's the situation here?" Kevin's voice carried the weight of someone trying to sound more important than he was. Sarah explained reluctantly, her eyes never leaving Frank's face. She'd seen Desperation before. Her own grandmother had struggled after her grandfather died, but this felt different. This man carried himself like someone who'd once commanded respect. "Shoplifting," Kevin announced, as if diagnosing a disease. "Sir, I need to see some identification while we wait for police." Frank's wallet contained his driver's license, his Medicare card, and a faded photograph of Martha on their wedding day. No credit cards. They'd been canceled months ago. No cash beyond the coins in his pocket. But tucked behind Martha's picture was something Kevin couldn't see: his military ID, expired but treasured, and a small card identifying him as a Medal of Valor recipient. "Please," Frank whispered, "I serve this country. I just need—" "Everyone has a story," Kevin interrupted. "Law's the law." Maria Gonzalez had been filling her Honda Civic when she noticed the commotion through the store's windows. As a social worker, she'd developed an instinct for recognizing people in crisis. Something about the old man's posture, straight despite his obvious distress, triggered her professional concern. She entered the store as Kevin was explaining procedure to Sarah. "Excuse me, what's happening?" When Sarah reluctantly explained, Maria's heart sank. She'd seen this before: elderly veterans caught between pride and poverty, too ashamed to ask for help until desperation forced their hand. "I'll pay for the sandwich," Maria offered immediately, "and anything else he needs." Kevin shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, I appreciate the gesture, but he's already committed a crime. We can't just pretend it didn't happen because someone offers to pay after the fact." "A crime?" Maria's voice rose. "Looking at him, what do you see, a criminal or someone who needs help?" But Kevin had his procedures, his newfound authority, his determination to prove himself. "I see someone who broke the law. Age doesn't excuse theft." Frank listened to them debate his fate like he wasn't there, feeling smaller with each word. 23 minutes later, Phoenix PD Unit 247 pulled into the Shell station. Officers Rodriguez and Johnson emerged into the blazing heat, their uniforms already wilting in the desert sun. Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran and Iraq War survivor, immediately noticed something familiar about the old man sitting hunched on the plastic chair. "What's your name, sir?" Rodriguez asked, his tone professional but not unkind. "Frank Morrison." The name came out like a confession. "You serve—" Frank's head lifted slightly. "Marines? Vietnam?" Rodriguez felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd seen too many veterans struggling, too many heroes forgotten by the system they'd served. But procedure was procedure, and Kevin was insisting on pressing charges. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison," Rodriguez said, producing handcuffs. "I have to follow protocol." The metal was cold against Frank's wrists, colder than the monsoon rains of Southeast Asia, colder than the loneliness of his empty apartment. As the cuffs clicked shut, Frank felt the last of his dignity slip away. Customers stared, phones appeared, and somewhere in the distance he could hear Kevin explaining to someone how he'd caught a shoplifter. Frank Morrison, Medal of Valor recipient, was now just another criminal in the eyes of strangers. The handcuffs felt heavier than any equipment Frank had carried in combat. Each click of the metal was a nail in the coffin of his self-respect. Around him, the convenience store had become a theater with customers as audience to his humiliation. Phones emerged like weapons, recording his shame for posterity. "Please," Frank whispered, but his voice was lost in the murmur of judgment from strangers who saw only a criminal, not a hero. Kevin stood nearby, chest puffed with the satisfaction of a job well done. "This is what happens when you steal," he announced to no one in particular. "Doesn't matter how old you are." The words hit Frank like shrapnel. He thought of the Marines who died in his arms at Khe Sanh, young men who'd never grow old enough to face this kind of degradation. Would they understand? Would they forgive him for falling so far from the man they'd believed him to be? Sarah watched from behind the counter, tears threatening to spill. This wasn't justice. It was cruelty, dressed in procedure. Maria stood frozen, her offer to help rejected, watching a system fail someone who'd given everything for it. Rodriguez felt the weight of his badge, remembering his own struggles after Iraq. Sometimes the uniform felt like armor. Today, it felt like a prison. But rules were rules, and Kevin was determined to see them followed to the letter. The black Jeep Wrangler pulled into the station like fate arriving on schedule. Colonel James Mitchell, USMC Ret, had been driving home from a meeting at Luke Air Force Base when he'd decided to stop for coffee. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his silver hair and weathered face telling stories of 3 decades in service. Through the store's windows, he saw the tableau, an elderly man in handcuffs, surrounded by police and onlookers. Something about this scene triggered his instincts. The old man's posture, even in defeat, carried a familiar dignity. Mitchell entered the store, his presence immediately commanding attention. He'd learned long ago to read people quickly. It had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. The old man in handcuffs wasn't a criminal. He was a soldier. "What's the situation here?" Mitchell's voice carried natural authority. Kevin, eager to impress what he assumed was another customer, launched into his explanation, caught this old man shoplifting, had a sandwich hidden in his jacket. "We're processing him now." Mitchell studied Frank more carefully. The faded Marine Corps cap, the way he held his shoulders despite the humiliation, the look in his eyes. Not defiance, but the quiet acceptance of someone who'd faced worse than this and survived. "What's your name, son?" Mitchell asked Frank directly. "Frank Morrison, sir." "Unit, 1st Marine Division, sir. Vietnam, 68 to 69. The store fell silent. Mitchell felt the familiar chill that came with recognition. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. "Tom Mitchell here. I need you to run a name through the database. Frank Morrison, 1st Marines, Vietnam era." "Yeah, I'll hold." The 30 seconds of silence stretched like hours. Frank didn't understand what was happening, but something in the stranger's bearing reminded him of officers he'd respected, men who'd earned their authority through competence and courage, rather than simply wearing it like a costume. Mitchell's expression changed as he listened to the voice on the other end. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and when he looked at Frank again, it was with a recognition that transcended the present moment. "Sergeant Frank Morrison," Mitchell said slowly, his voice carrying across the store. "Medal of Valor, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device, saved 12 Marines at Khe Sanh during the Tet Offensive." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Kevin's confident expression faltered. Rodriguez straightened unconsciously. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mitchell approached Frank, his movements deliberate and respectful. When he was close enough to look directly into the old Marine's eyes, he did something that transformed the entire scene. He came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. Sergeant Morrison, Colonel James Mitchell, United States Marine Corps. It is my honor to salute you, sir. The salute hung between them like a bridge across 50 years of forgotten service. Frank, despite the handcuffs, straightened his shoulders and attempted to return the honor, his muscle memory overriding his shame. Tears carved tracks down his weathered cheeks, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of despair. "At ease, Sergeant," Mitchell said softly, his own eyes glistening. He turned to face the store, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the presence of an American hero. This man crawled through enemy fire to save the lives of 12 Marines. While you were debating whether to show mercy for a stolen sandwich, he was bleeding for your freedom." The store had become a cathedral, silent and reverent. Kevin's radio crackled, but he ignored it, staring at Frank as if seeing him for the first time. Rodriguez felt his own military training kick in, recognizing the presence of someone who'd earned respect through blood and sacrifice. Maria wiped her eyes, understanding now why her instincts had screamed that this was wrong. Sarah stepped out from behind the counter, her young face reflecting a new understanding of the man she'd almost helped destroy. But he still stole something. Kevin stammered, his authority crumbling like sand. "I mean, I understand he's a veteran, but the law..." Mitchell's gaze could have melted steel. "The law, son, this man fought to preserve the law you're hiding behind. He bled so you could have the luxury of enforcing petty regulations without understanding their purpose." "I was just doing my job," Kevin protested weakly. "Your job," Mitchell said quietly, "is to serve and protect. Tell me, how does humiliating a war hero serve anyone? How does handcuffing a man who saved lives protect anything but your own ego?" The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin's face flushed red, his certainty evaporating under the weight of Mitchell's words and his own growing understanding of what he'd done. Rodriguez stepped forward, keys already in hand. "Sir, I think we can resolve this without charges." Mitchell turned to Rodriguez with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Officer, I'll personally guarantee payment for anything Sergeant Morrison needs. I'll also take full responsibility for his welfare going forward." Rodriguez nodded immediately, unlocking Frank's handcuffs with hands that trembled slightly. "Of course, sir. No charges will be filed." Kevin opened his mouth to protest, but the words died under Mitchell's stare. The young security guard was beginning to understand that he'd stumbled into something far bigger than shoplifting, something that involved honor and sacrifice and values he'd never been tested on. Frank rubbed his wrists, feeling circulation return along with something he'd thought lost forever: dignity. The metal had left marks, but they would fade. The shame might take longer. "I don't deserve this," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did something wrong. I stole." Mitchell placed a firm hand on Frank's shoulder. "Sergeant, in your entire life, have you ever taken anything that wasn't yours?" Frank shook his head. "Have you ever failed to help someone in need?" Again, a shake of the head. Have you ever run from a fight when others were counting on you? No, sir. Then one moment of desperation doesn't define you. It defines the system that failed you. Mitchell's voice carried across the store. This man gave his youth, his health, and his peace of mind for this country. If taking a sandwich when he's starving is his greatest sin, then he's a better man than most. Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. Mr. Morrison, I'm so sorry. I should have seen. Mitchell addressed the entire store, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded men in combat. Look around you. Look at this man. This is what happens when we forget our heroes. This is the result of a society that thanks veterans for their service with empty words while they struggle in silence. He pulled out his wallet, extracting several bills. Sarah, I want you to ring up everything Sergeant Morrison needs. Food, supplies, whatever he requires. And I want you to set up an account for him. He's earned the right to eat without begging. A trucker named Bill stepped forward, his own wallet appearing. Count me in, Colonel. My dad was in Korea. I know what it's like. Helen, an elderly woman who'd been buying lottery tickets, added her voice. My husband was Navy, Pacific Theater. This is wrong what almost happened here. One by one, other customers began stepping forward, offering money support, understanding. The store that had been a place of judgment became a sanctuary of redemption. Kevin stood apart, watching the transformation with growing horror at his own actions. I didn't know, he whispered. David Chen, owner of Chen Construction, had been filling his truck when he heard the commotion. Now he stood before Frank with an offer that would change everything. Sergeant Morrison, my company needs a security consultant, someone with real experience, real leadership. The job pays $3,500 a month, part-time hours, full benefits. Are you interested? Frank stared at him in disbelief. Sir, I'm 78 years old. Experience doesn't have an expiration date, David replied, and I need someone I can trust absolutely, someone who's proven their character under fire. Mitchell smiled, seeing the moment when hope returned to Frank's eyes. What do you say, Sergeant, ready to serve again? Frank straightened to his full height, and for the first time in years, he looked like the Marine he'd always been. Yes, sir, I'm ready. The store erupted in applause, the sound washing over Frank like absolution. Within 2 hours, Frank Morrison's life had been completely transformed. Mitchell had not only paid for groceries, but had also connected Frank with veteran services he'd been too proud to seek. Maria had provided contact information for social workers specializing in elderly veterans, and Sarah had personally apologized while setting up a permanent account for Frank's needs. Kevin had requested a private moment with Frank, his apology sincere and heartfelt. Sir, I'm sorry. I was so focused on rules that I forgot about people. My grandfather was a veteran, and I should have known better. Rodriguez and Johnson had shaken Frank's hand before leaving, both men visibly moved by the encounter. Thank you for your service, Sergeant, Rodriguez had said, and thank you for reminding us why we wear these badges. The other customers had contributed over $400 to help Frank get back on his feet, their generosity overwhelming the old Marine who'd forgotten that kindness still existed in the world. 6 months later, Frank Morrison had become a local legend. His story, shared on social media by Maria, had gone viral, inspiring the creation of the Forgotten Heroes Fund to help struggling veterans nationwide. The fund had raised over $2 million in its first year. David Chen had been true to his word, and Frank's work as a security consultant had given him purpose beyond mere survival. His experience and wisdom had prevented 3 potential workplace accidents and had helped train a new generation of workers in safety and leadership. The Shell station had installed a plaque near the entrance in honor of all veterans who served with courage and deserve our respect. Sarah had been promoted to manager, and she'd implemented a veteran discount program that had become a model for other businesses. Kevin had enrolled in college studying social work, determined to help people rather than simply enforce rules. 1 year later, at a Veterans Day ceremony, Frank stood before a crowd of hundreds wearing his dress blue uniform for the first time in decades. Mitchell sat in the front row beaming with pride. "I once thought I was forgotten," Frank said, his voice strong and clear. "I thought my service didn't matter anymore. But I learned that heroes aren't defined by their lowest moments. They're defined by how they rise from them." He looked directly at Mitchell. "And sometimes all it takes is one person to remind us who we really are. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a salute from a fellow Marine who refuses to let a brother fall." The applause was thunderous, but Frank heard something else in it, the sound of a hero coming home